France, a nation of monumental achievements, some of which are rivaled by none. For much of its history, spanning well over 1,000 years, France was a dominant player of European history, and indeed in many ages, the dominant player. It was the home of many great empires. The Empire of Charlemagne, which laid the foundation for much of modern Western Europe. The colonial empire of the Bourbons, which spread French language, culture, and rule across the seas. And the empire of Napoleon, which was inches away from total domination of the European continent and beyond just a little over 200 years ago. France is also the home of a number of major intellectual, technological, philosophical, cultural, and political achievements as well. Many aspects of the modern world have their birthplace in France, and today, France remains a powerful and influential nation. Hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. I'm Justin, and today I would like to thank you all for joining us as we now add France to the list of nations and peoples whose history we have fully covered in our documentary series. Alors, mesdames et messieurs, allons-y. Before we begin, I would like to thank Gordian III, J.L. Mickabee, Ryan V, Captain Supercow, Charles Fong, and Travis Simonson for being our most recent supporters on Patreon. They join these supporters who make these videos possible. Europe, the 5th century AD. The Western Roman Empire is collapsing. As the old order begins to falter in the West, new peoples begin to move into the former lands of the Roman Empire to stake their claims. One such land was a place that the Romans called Gallia, Gaul. The Romans had occupied Gaul for centuries, though they were far from the first. In ancient times, in the south, the Phoenicians and the Greeks were active. One city, Massalia, founded by the Greeks, still stands to this day as the city of Marseille. Through much of modern France, however, it was the Celts who ruled. There were scores of separate, essentially independent Celtic tribes, but Julius Caesar narrowed them down to two main groups, the Gauls and the Belgae. The Aquitani, who were not Celtic, were an important presence in the southwest as well. It was Caesar who subdued the region and brought it within the Roman Empire long ago. Now, centuries later, new landlords were arriving on the scene. To the Romans, these people were squabbling barbarians, whose kingdoms paled in comparison to the once mighty empire. To them, their world was falling apart. No one could have known what future was beginning with these new peoples. Following Rome's collapse, Gaul was divided between a handful of Germanic tribes. The Visigoths, Burgundians, and Alemanni were important players in the region. In the north was what historians call the Kingdom of Soissons, a Roman rum state still holding out after the fall in 476. In the far left corner were the Bretons, Celts from the island of Britain, pushed out of their homeland by the Germanic Anglo-Saxon invaders. However, it is with one group in particular that we begin our story, the people called the Franki, the Franks. The Franks were a pagan Germanic tribe already present in the region before 476. They had been living around modern Belgium and slowly expanding into and settling modern France as the Roman Empire collapsed. Like most Germanic peoples, they were not united into one nation or even tribe, but rather there were multiple different ones, which at times worked cohesively. The specific group in mention are the Salian Franks, currently under the rule of Childeric I, son of the semi-legendary Frankish king Merovingian, whose name brings us the name of the Merovingian dynasty. Though Germanic barbarians, these rulers were not necessarily always enemies of Rome, but in certain circumstances, allies. It is quite likely that Merovingian fought on the side of Rome at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains against Attila and the Huns, as the Romans relied more and more on barbarian allies toward the end of the West. Whether or not Merovingian was a descendant of a Germanic sea god, well, I leave that question up to the viewer. King Childeric would only live for a few more years, but his son, bold and ambitious, had a long and eventful future ahead of him. He was named Clodovic, though we refer to him as Clovis. Clovis became the king of the Salian Franks in 481 AD. He was only 15, though this was old enough in the eyes of his people to lead. He got right to work. He had great plans and, years later in 486, was able to enact them. After assembling an army of around 6,000 men, he invaded the kingdom of Soissons. At the Battle of Soissons, Clovis and his allies defeated the enemy leader, Syagrius, and annexed his territory, pillaging it and reorganizing it. Clovis's domain doubled in size, the first of many victories to come. He then moved his capital to this new territory, from the city of Tournai to a city which we now know as Paris. With his first great victory, however, came his first great obstacle. As mentioned, Clovis and his people were pagans. They followed an ancient Germanic religion related to the one which the later Norse Vikings followed, but they now found themselves in the domain of the Christians. While the Western Roman Empire was gone, the influence of Rome was certainly not. I do not simply mean that the empire still existed strongly in the East, as it did, nor do I simply mean that the Roman people still saw themselves as Romans. This is also true. But the Roman organization of the continent was still important to those who lived in it, even after the empire itself was gone. Roman culture, language, and social structure lived on. In the city of Rome, the Senate still functioned. As for the Roman people, they did not believe that their empire was actually gone, and it would be centuries before this was accepted. Furthermore, the Roman religion, and the Catholic Church which mandated it, was not to be trifled with, and Clovis would attempt to maintain positive relations with them. His first step was to take a Catholic wife, Clotilda. With his power base in the Roman land secure, Clovis was able to bolster his ranks and better challenge his neighbors. One of his primary goals was unification with the other Frankish groups. He sought to bring them under one banner, his. He set out on a bloody campaign to unite his people, killing enemy leaders, many of whom were his relatives, to ensure this unity. As the Frankish people united, he then turned his attention to the lands of his Germanic rivals and neighbors in Gaul. His war against the Alemanni, beginning around 496, the details and dates of Clovis's reign are not always clear, is among the most famous and important of these conflicts. They met at the Battle of Tolbiac. Here, as the fighting raged on, the battle was not going as expected. The Franks were losing, being driven back by the Alemanni. According to the historical sources, namely Gregory of Tours, it was here where, out of desperation, Clovis turned not to his pagan gods, but to the god of his wife, the Christian god, praying to him for assistance. As he did so, the battle turned, and the Franks won the day. Now, to those of you who have seen my Rome and Byzantium documentaries, this may sound familiar. A very similar thing happened to the Emperor Constantine at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. The Battle of Tolbiac had a significant impact on Clovis. He would take interest in this new god, and indeed would come to be compared to Constantine. Clovis would go on to defeat his other neighbors in battle, most notably the Visigoths. He undertook his campaign against them in 507 to liberate the Romans from the Arians, who ruled over them, and prevented raiding to ensure that this remained a war of liberation. In 507, he met them at the Battle of Vouillers, driving them out of Gaul and obtaining much of Aquitaine. For his successes, military, religious, and legal, he was celebrated across Christendom, and even received a title of some sort, again, it is not known exactly what, from the Byzantine Emperor Anastasius. It is significant that Clovis was to become a Catholic. I mentioned recently the Arians. Arianism was a form of Christianity that was common among the Germanic peoples after, and before, the fall of Western Rome. Essentially, Arians held that Jesus was distinct from God. They denied the concept of the Trinity. Ironically, some sources state that the Romans viewed Arianism as worse than paganism, as Arianism was outright heresy, whereas paganism was viewed as understandable ignorance, that their ancestors once suffered from as well. Clovis may very well have converted to Arianism for a while before becoming a Catholic, but he did end up with Catholicism. Much like Constantine, he was baptized toward the end of his life on Christmas Day in 508. With this baptism, historians say, the French monarchy was born. The French people regard Clovis as the founder of their nation. However, it would be some time before something like France would emerge in the modern sense. Clovis died around the year 511. Which of his sons then succeeded him to the throne? All four. This is where things get messy. In most monarchies throughout history, not just in Europe but across the world, when one leader dies, the throne passes to a single child, usually the oldest son, with the monarch's domain intact. This is called primogeniture. The Franks did not practice this. They practiced what is called partible inheritance. The lands of the father were divided among all his sons after his death as if it were his personal property, and basically that is how they saw it. Though Clovis's domain looked like the beginning of modern France, and indeed it is, these territories were to be split and rearranged and fought over by kings of the same people and family for centuries. Why did they do this? A number of reasons, but the best answer, I think, is that the modern concept of a state was a foreign concept. It hadn't yet developed, and was not the way of the Frankish people. The Romans were the closest thing to it in the West. Of course, the intention was not to create separate countries, but to divide the lands of one people among different rulers. They were supposed to get along, but of course this did not always happen. There is no shortage of the tales of sibling rivalry in the history of the world's monarchies. Here we have no exception. The territory was divided in the manner shown here between Clotaire, Childebert, Clodomir, and Theuderic. It's worth noting, though, the boundaries of these four subkingdoms were not well defined, which furthered the problems. These four brothers would fight with each other, but would also invade other lands, such as those of the Burgundians, and, as the Ostrogothic kingdom fell to the Roman Emperor Justinian, the area of Provence, expanding the overall influence of the realm of the Franks. A common pastime of the Frankish kings was dying young. Clovis was 45 when he died, and two of his sons died before the age of 50 as well, each without children. When Childebert died, the whole of the kingdom was seized by Clotaire I, and Francia was fully reunited in 558. He died only a few years later, however, in 561, and, well, he had 4 sons. Well, he had 5, but he had to kill one for being a rebel. Medieval royal families. Thus the process restarted. The sibling wars would continue among Clovis's grandsons, undermining the power of the country, though details of these events are quite limited. With Clovis's grandsons, a common template for future divisions began to be established. 4 regions in particular: Neustria, Austrasia, Burgundia, and Aquitaine. Though it's important to note that the borders would fluctuate and that the kingdom was not always divided between 4 individuals. For example, in 567, it was divided among 3. Sigebert, king of Austrasia, died in 575 when he was assassinated under the order of his brother's wife. But his wife, Brunhilda, outlived him, and through her retention of power, became a more famous historical figure, becoming the regent of both Austrasia and Burgundy by navigating the messy politics of the Franks and holding 3 separate regencies in her long life. She was a favorable ruler at first, but later became hated for her plotting and cruelty. In 613, she was defeated in battle by Clotaire II, who once more reunited the Frankish realm. She, around the age of 70, was accused of the murder of 10 members of the royal family, tortured, and was executed by dismemberment. Clotaire II thus assumed his rule and would rule until 629. He would be known as Clotaire the Young and Clotaire the Great. Though perhaps regarded as great, it was under him that the Merovingian dynasty began to slowly enter into a period of decline, for which he helped set the stage. One decision which led to this was increasing the power of the mayor of the palace, or the mayordomo, an office held by the Frankish kings as a sort of prime minister, though with much less power hitherto. He made this a hereditary position held for life. After his death in 629, the realm was divided between 2 of his sons. The way for les rois fainéants, the idle or do-nothing kings, had been paved, as the Merovingians lost power to their surrounding nobles and the mayors of the palace. In 639, this change was certainly more pronounced as the realm was further divided following the death of Dagobert I. In 680, Pepin of Herstal became the Mayordomo of Austrasia. Pepin went to war against and defeated the forces of Neustria and Burgundy at the Battle of Tertry, and in the subsequent peace treaty, forced the mayordomos of both kingdoms to resign. He hence became the mayor of all three areas in 687. Importantly, it was here that Pepin took on the title Dux et Princeps Francorum, Duke and Prince of the Franks, a more appropriate regal title. He held this position until his death in 714, in which time he expanded the power of the Franks further, notably by pushing into Germany. The Merovingians were becoming puppet kings, and Pepin's dynasty of mayors of the palace, what would become the Carolingians, were on their way up. In 714, Pepin died. A civil war erupted afterward over power among the Franks, but by 718, Pepin's son Charles became the new mayordomo. Apart from consistent wars with the Germans of the East, the majority of the problems that the Franks faced over the years was with each other. They did not, however, exist in a vacuum. Other forces were at work throughout the world, and a great new empire would soon be on the doorstep of the Frankish realm. Charles would spend much of his career fighting and conquering the peoples of modern Germany and fighting more internal civil wars, but he is best remembered for the fact that he would have to make a stand against this more powerful new empire, and the outcome of the stand would spell the future of not only France, but indeed nearly all of Europe. Furthermore, it would earn him the name Martel. In the 7th century, in the Middle East, a new power arose that challenged the traditional powers of Rome and Persia, the Islamic caliphates. With unstoppable determination and religious zeal, they expanded rapidly, building an empire stretching from the borders of India into Spain, toppling the kingdom of the Visigoths and forging one of the largest empires in world history. Now, the Islamic conquerors were on the doorstep of the Frankish homeland. In 718, they began expanding into Frankish territory. In 721, they were met at the Battle of Toulouse by the ruler of Aquitaine, which was semi-independent at this time, Duke Odo the Great, so named as he was the first to defeat the advancing Muslims in Europe here. They were crushed and forced to retreat, but only temporarily. They continued raiding, and in 732, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, a new commander of the Islamic forces, set out to continue the conquest of Europe by seizing Gaul. Odo the Great was unable to repel them this time, and they began marching forward. The Frankish army under Charles moved from the east to meet them. Odo was not exactly Charles's ally. He had resisted his rule and even fought against him, but they were Franks with a mutual enemy, and so he pledged his allegiance to Charles. The two armies met near the city of Tours. Abdul Rahman was confident of victory. The European kingdoms were weak and squabbled amongst themselves. If they had taken down both Eastern Rome and Persia, this should be a simple matter. He was wrong. He attacked on October 10th, hoping to crush his enemies before the onset of winter, but the Arabs were unable to break the Frankish forces. It was a decisive defeat for them. The Franks lost around 1,000 men. The Umayyads lost over 10 times this, including Abdul Rahman himself. The Muslims were forced to fall back into Iberia. Never again would their armies attempt to conquer France. Charles was revered across Christendom as a savior. It is from this battle that he earned the title Martel, the old French word for hammer, Charles the Hammer. Aquitaine remained distinct from Charles's domain, but Francia had been saved. He continued his rule and returned to fighting Germanic tribes such as the Frisians and Saxons. In 737, King Theodoric IV died, and a new king was not appointed until a few years after Charles Martel's death in 741. He was the man behind the curtain, but by this point, the curtain was completely transparent, and there wasn't really a need for a Merovingian king to sit on the throne, so one wasn't appointed. The days of the Merovingians were ending, and they would soon be fully replaced by the Carolingians, whose line would shine in European history. Charles died in 741. His position as mayordomo was divided between his two sons, Carloman and Pepin that year. Childeric III was made the Merovingian puppet king in 743. In 747, Carloman resigned to pursue the life of a monk, a choice which seems to have been voluntary. This left Pepin, known as Pepin the Short, in control of the Frankish kingdom. One might wonder, why bother with this facade? Why were so many Merovingian kings placed on the throne to sit there and look kingly but do nothing? Well, there was a religious significance to the kings. It was not just about power. In fact, it is somewhat comparable to many modern monarchs of Europe. Their power is extremely limited, but their position is deemed to be of great importance to the state for traditional, religious, and symbolic reasons. This was perhaps even more so the case for the Frankish kings of this era. Who could remove a figure of such importance as the king of the Franks? Well, a figure of equal importance, of course. Pepin the Short began discussing the situation with Pope Zacharias, commenting on its irrationality. The Pope agreed with Pepin on this issue, and he had more than one motive for doing so, which we will soon discuss. Pepin used this agreement to justify his next actions. Childeric was deposed in 751. His hair was cut, and he was sent to live in a monastery, where he ended his days. The facade was ending, and, with the vote of the Frankish nobles, Pepin was crowned King of the Franks, the first of the Carolingian kings. One of Pepin's first acts was to pay the Pope back for his assistance. As all this had been going on, Pope Zacharias had died and was succeeded by Stephen II. The city of Rome was in serious trouble. The Italian peninsula had been reconquered by the Eastern Romans, also known as the Byzantine Empire, around 2 centuries prior, by the aforementioned Justinian. It was under them that the popes had lived up to now. However, after the death of Justinian, the Roman hold on Italy had become tenuous. A Germanic group called the Lombards had invaded the peninsula in the late 6th century, and Italy became a patchwork of Byzantine and Lombard lands. Now, Eastern Roman rule was deteriorating further. The Pope was at risk of being under the Lombard thumb, an outcome which seemed worse than being under the thumb of the borderline heretic Eastern Romans. The Franks soon went to war against the Lombards. Pepin defeated them, and the Lombard king Aistulf was forced to make concessions to the Franks and to the church. It is from this that, in 756, Pepin was able to make a donation, often called the donation of Pepin, to the church, which would have a profound impact on history and, though much reduced, lasts to this very day. A strip of land stretching from Ravenna in the northeast to Rome in central Italy was granted to the church, establishing the basis for the Papal States. This was the Pope's land. Pepin would spend much of the rest of his reign in the west of his kingdom, fighting the Islamic Iberians and trying to take control of Aquitaine from its rebellious leaders. He died in 768. Pepin had established a new line and brought Francia to a new height, extending its influence into Italy, beating back the Muslims, expanding into Germany, and bringing cohesion to Francia itself. Such power, however, often attracts rivalry. The Byzantine Empire in particular had taken offense to Frankish meddling in Italy, and the Pope's decision to favor these barbarians over the traditional Roman emperor. The rivalry between these two powers, or more broadly, the Christian West and East, was only just beginning, but indeed the role of the Carolingians was just beginning. After Pepin's death, his son Carloman inherited the eastern portion of the kingdom and his son Charles the west. The elder brother Charles was not content with this alone, however. He had great ambitions, and his realization of many of those ambitions would lead him to be known as Charles the Great, Carolus Magnus, Karl der Grosse, or Charlemagne. Charlemagne was likely in his mid-20s when he came to the throne. He no doubt showed intelligence, ambition, and fortitude from a young age. His first opportunity to prove himself came with the war he inherited from his father. Trouble with, of course, Aquitaine and their ally, a very ancient people of Europe, the Basques. Charlemagne was victorious here, bringing Aquitaine firmly under his rule. In 771, his younger brother Carloman died of illness, and Charlemagne was able to inherit his territory to reunify the Frankish kingdom. Now wielding the full might of Francia, the stage was set for a long and eventful career. Charlemagne sought, first and foremost, to expand his domain. In his career, he would go to war with nearly all of his neighbors. Some of his earliest enemies were the Saxons and the Lombards. The war he waged on the Saxons, starting in 772, was only just the beginning of a series of wars. It would last most of his reign until 804. His wars against their later leader, Widukind, especially demanded an excessive amount of his attention. His goal was to neutralize their raiding habits into his territory, to convert them, by the sword, to the new Christian religion, and to take their territory. It was also in 772 that Charlemagne went to war once more against the Lombards. They were causing problems for His Holiness, Pope Adrian I. In 773, Charlemagne crossed the Alps to meet the Lombards in battle. By the following year, they were defeated. Charlemagne then became the master of northern and central Italy, and he displayed it by claiming the kingship of the Lombards and crowning himself with their iron crown. This was the first of his many great conquests. It was a rather bold and swift conquest, especially relative to many of his later ones. Charlemagne forged his empire slowly, piece by piece. He would campaign nearly every year of his rule and was victorious on nearly every campaign. He would settle each new territory with his people, put them under the administration of counts, which might have been overseen by his sons, and retained what he had conquered. Along the borders of his territory, he would set up marches, territories which were governed by military leaders. Over the next few decades, he would go to war with the Bretons, the Basques, the Islamic forces, the Bavarians and other Germanic groups, the Avars, the Slavs, and others, being successful on most occasions, though he never could fully subdue the Basques, also known as the Gascons, from the same etymology, nor the Bretons. He constructed a navy to combat Arab or Saracen raiders who had been attacking the Mediterranean. Though he preoccupied himself with war, it is important to note that Charlemagne was not simply a man of the sword. It is in his rule that what historians refer to as the Carolingian Renaissance began. This was, one could say, a period of spring weather during the winter of the Dark Ages. He emphasized learning, literature, art, and architecture. It was under him that things such as question marks, lowercase letters, and spaces in between words became more commonplace in writing. Education in the Frankish Empire reached a new height. For much of its history, and most of Dark Age Europe up to this point, literacy rates were about 1%. Most kings couldn't even write. It isn't clear whether or not Charlemagne was literate, but he certainly tried. Historians often note that many classical works were likely preserved solely because Charlemagne orchestrated their preservation. It is in 800 AD that Charlemagne obtained his highest position. On Christmas Day of that year, Charlemagne was attending Mass in Rome. As he knelt before the altar, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon Charlemagne's head and proclaimed him Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans. This was quite a title. It was essentially claiming that Charlemagne had brought back the Western Roman Empire, that he was the successor of Romulus Augustulus, who had been deposed in 476. The title would one day evolve into the title of Holy Roman Emperor, a line of which Charlemagne is often seen as the first. It's not known whether or not Charlemagne wanted such a title, nor is it clear that he even knew that it was coming to him. Though he and his people still preferred their Frankish identity to a Roman one, he did use the title and enforced his claims to it. Against whom would he have to enforce these claims? Why, the actual Romans, of course. The Eastern Roman Emperor, or rather, Empress. And with that, we have another justification for Charlemagne's coronation. Irene of Athens had seized power in the Byzantine Empire, becoming empress after she blinded her own son, which led to his death. Accordingly, as the Pope did not recognize the legitimacy of a female empress of Rome, as there had never been one in history, he felt that the position was vacant. This would cause conflict between the Franks and Byzantines, which would lead to war. There was a significance to being Roman which is important. It was not simply flowery symbolism. The Roman Empire was the one true empire of the earth, which is the main reason that the title was contested. A solution, however, was proposed. Charlemagne was an emperor. Irene was an empress. Can I make it any more obvious? Charlemagne proposed marriage to her as a means of uniting the two empires. Irene seemed to seriously consider this, but was overthrown before such an arrangement was made, partially because she did consider it. In 806, war was waged between the Franks and Byzantines, which ended in 810 in a truce. Charlemagne was recognized as in-emperor but not Roman emperor. It was not long after this that, in January of 814, Charlemagne became ill. To us, in hindsight, it is quite clear that Charlemagne's accomplishments were some of the most remarkable of his era, and his empire the greatest and largest that would be seen in Western Europe for quite some time. He would later be known as Pater Europae, the father of Europe. Indeed, his Frankish Empire, which, at the time of his death, stretched from the edges of Spain to modern western Poland, laid the foundations for not only France, but also Germany, the Lowlands, and other states. Charlemagne died later that month. He had earned the title, the Great, but the question was now, to what extent could his successors live up to it? It was immensely difficult to rule such a vast empire in this age, and it would take leaders of equal ability to maintain it. Furthermore, as if domestic problems weren't enough, not all of Charlemagne's business outside his empire had been settled. Enemies still lurked on the horizon. One such enemy was a people to the north of the German Saxons, a pagan people who had heard of the forced conversions of the Saxons and were perturbed by them. These were the Danes. A new age was beginning in Europe, an age of Vikings, and they would threaten all that the Franks had established. Even the mighty Charlemagne was unwilling to break the traditional Germanic custom of partible inheritance. Furthermore, he was reluctant to pass on the title of Emperor of Rome because of the conflict it invited. However, fortunately for the integrity of his empire, only one son had outlived him, Louis, who became known as Louis the Pious or Louis the First. Louis was a just ruler, but as his moniker implied, he was perhaps better suited for the life of a monk than an emperor. He came to the throne in 814. After a near-death experience when a bridge collapsed under him, he began preparing for his succession. He, too, would honor Germanic inheritance laws, but there would now be a twist. His eldest son, Lothar, was to be emperor. His brothers were to be kings of their respective territories, but subordinate to the imperator. As the Frankish Empire had evolved into something more than it had once been before Charlemagne, the need for unity became more stressed. Oh, but how old habits die hard. Though the Frankish Empire was still mighty, Louis was not a military commander. Territory was slowly lost in his reign to Bulgarian invasion and Slavic uprisings. However, it would not be these which dealt a major blow to the empire, nor even the Vikings who increased their activity in the region at this time, but rather the civil wars which would soon be erupting over the questions of succession. Civil wars broke out in Louis's later reign among his sons. From 833 to 834 he was even temporarily deposed. Louis died in 840, and his sons moved to secure their positions. His third son, Pepin, had already died, and so only Lothar, Louis, and Charles were left to divide the empire. Civil war erupted again, and in 843 they came to an agreement, with the Treaty of Verdun. Louis, who would become known as Louis the German, would inherit East Francia. Charles, who would be known as Charles the Bald, would inherit West Francia. Lothar would inherit Middle Francia. Middle Francia, as we will see, does not last long. It was basically a geographically implausible country, a thin borderland separated by the Alps. However, East Francia would lay the foundation for the future Holy Roman Empire, or Germany. In West Francia, the foundations for the Kingdom of France were made. Charles the Bald was not exactly a popular king. His relations with his brothers were at first peaceable, but his relations with others were less so. The Bretons revolted against Frankish rule. Rebellions once more sprouted up in Aquitaine, and worst of all, the Vikings ravaged Francia, the west especially. By navigating Europe's waterways, these pagan warrior raiders pounced on the fractured empire with a terrible fury. In 845, a Viking leader recorded as Regin Heris, or Ragnar Lothbrok, sailed up the River Seine, laid siege to, and sacked the city of Paris in the spring. The Norse terrified the Frankish people. They sacrificed over 100 of them to their god Odin during the siege. Charles was forced to pay them off. Now, keep in mind, Vikings was a good show, but not exactly the accurate history. Anyway, for now though, if the Vikings wanted to find some money, they knew where to find someone who would give in to ransom. These tributes would become frequent. However, Charles would make an effort to strengthen his army and his kingdom in response. Lothar died in 855, and his territory was divided among his sons into Italy, Lotharingia, and Provence. Lotharingia is the etymological origin of the word Lorraine. Not long after the death of Lothar I, fighting broke out between Charles and Louis over Lotharingia. Germany and France would fight over the region of what would become Alsace-Lorraine until basically World War II. By 870, Middle Francia had been divided between the two kings, with Italy going in its own direction. Charles the Bald died in 877, with the throne passing to his son Louis the Stammerer, though he and Charles's other heirs died young as well. The empire was briefly reunited in 884 under Charles the Fat, though this was out of coincidence. Essentially, all the other heirs had died. Under his rule, Paris was besieged again by the Norsemen, but the city's defenses held, thanks in large part to Count Odo, and on this occasion they were driven back. Charles the Fat would be overthrown in 887, and the empire would not be reunited in this way ever again. In 898, Charles the Simple came to the throne of West Francia. This meant Charles the Straightforward, not Charles the Moron. It was under his rule that, in the 900s, the Norsemen came back, under the leader of the last siege of Paris named Rollo. They besieged cities such as Paris, and under immense pressure, Charles the Simple gave in. This time, however, gold was not sufficient. The Norsemen were granted an area of land in the north of Francia. Rollo converted to Christianity, was baptized, and possibly married a Frankish princess. The land would come to be known as the Land of the Northmen, or in Old French, Normands, becoming Normandy. True to their nature, the Norsemen would not settle down to a quiet and simple life. Their role in history would continue to be important. This did not solve the Viking problem. However, the Normans pledged to defend the king, and as a part of their deal, made efforts to ward off other Vikings. The other enemies all around Francia were consistent problems as well, however. Charles was overthrown in a revolt led by Robert I in 922, who was the son of the aforementioned Count Odo. After his death a year later, Robert's son Rudolf was elected to become king by the Frankish noblemen. Not feeling any loyalty to the monarchs whom they viewed as usurpers, the Normans joined other Viking groups in raiding Francia again. The Franks would also have to face the wrath of the Magyars, a nomadic steppe people who had migrated into Europe, and the Islamic Saracens of the Mediterranean. Rudolf died in 936, and was succeeded by Charles the Simple's son, Louis IV, who was intended to be a puppet monarch. This is where the monarchy tends to change hands a bit. There's a lot of characters involved, but the essential point is that the Carolingians, and a line which at this time was called the Robertians, those who followed Robert I, would be competing for power for some time. Much of Louis IV's reign was spent securing that reign against Hugh the Great, the son of Robert I, and the man who had tried to make him a puppet, as well as fighting off foreign invaders and disputing Lorraine with his East Frankish counterparts, now under the rule of Otto the Great. Hugh the Great was elevated to the title of Grand Duke of the Franks, but did not become king, and indeed he and Louis would bicker over what exactly this title meant. In truth, the position of king was once again becoming less and less important. As was the case in other areas of Europe, the nobility under the king were becoming the truly powerful ones across France. Louis IV died in 954, and was succeeded by his son Lothar, who had the approval of Hugh the Great as a part of his maneuvering. Lothar was only 13, and Hugh was, conveniently, to be regent. Hugh would die 2 years later, though, to be succeeded by his son in his position of Duke by Hugh Capet. Lothar's power was more limited than what would have been expected by a king. West Francia was highly decentralized and fragmented at this point. Much of the country was led by local leaders, often called princes. Ever since the death of Charlemagne, these leaders had taken advantage of the distractions caused by invading foes, namely the Vikings, Magyars, Saracens, and so forth, and the chaos surrounding the monarchy to gradually increase their own power, practically to the point of independence. The power Lothar did have was heavily influenced by others, namely Duke Hugh Capet. Lothar tried to wrest control of power and secure his succession, naming his son Louis his heir and junior king in 979. However, support for Hugh Capet became greater among the Franks than for him. Lothar died suddenly in 986 and was succeeded by his son Louis V, but as fate would have it, Louis died the year after his succession after falling off his horse. The Frankish nobles then came together and elected Hugh Capet to be their king. The line of the Carolingian kings of France had ended, though there were some Carolingians still alive. The way was now open for the Capetians to rule. This dynasty would one day extend outside of France and would be one of the most influential in European history. Hugh Capet's initial situation was similar to that of his predecessors. His vassals were uninterested in bowing to a central monarch at the cost of their own power. Accordingly, his direct domain was limited to just this area around Paris, known as the Ile-de-France, and some other scattered territories, shown here. The king dictated religious matters, but beyond this, he held very little power, and worked with the other princes of France as if they were foreign leaders, not so much subordinates. The princes insisted during this period on the right to elect their kings, and were sometimes successful in that aim. Modern French had certainly not yet developed, and many different languages were spoken across France. There wasn't a single currency either. Most regions used their own. Furthermore, the authority of these local princes was also challenged by their subordinates as well, making the issue of decentralization even worse. Hugh Capet would fail to a large extent to wield power over his vassals. The process of centralizing the monarchy would take centuries. However, his line had been established, and from its power base in Paris, it would, one day, be achieved. His son Robert followed him to the throne in 996. Robert II would also attempt to consolidate power, focusing specifically on Burgundy, of which he did manage to eventually become duke. Robert the Pious, as he is known, much like Louis the Pious, faced discontent and rebellion led by his 3 sons. He died in war against them in 1031 and was succeeded by his son Henry I. Henry would have another long reign, 29 years, but as was so often the case, his abilities as king were limited. He died in 1060 and was succeeded by his son Philip I. Philip would reign for 48 years until 1109. Major history was perhaps being made less so by these 2 monarchs than by the Duke of the Duchy of Normandy to the north, a man named William. William the Bastard, as he is known, succeeded his father Robert the Magnificent as Duke in 1035. As he was only a child, he had to contend for his position with rivals, though he had gained the support of the King Henry I in these battles and came out victorious. As William's power grew, Henry I would later be threatened by it and would become hostile, though William would beat him back as well. In the early 1050s, William conquered the county of Maine and later held influence across the whole north of modern France as an almost independent kingdom. Meanwhile, the King of England, Edward the Confessor, died in January of 1066. He had promised succession to multiple people in his life in order to win them over to his side, including William of Normandy. However, when he died, the Anglo-Saxon Harold Godwinson claimed the throne. This, to William, was not acceptable. Later that year, he invaded England and went to war with Harold. Harold was killed in the resulting Battle of Hastings between the two on October 14th of that year. William, who became William the Conqueror after this feat, was now both Duke of Normandy and King of England. This was the start of a new era not only for England but also for France. William holding 2 titles would be problematic. He was the Duke of Normandy, a nominal subject to the King of France, though he would continue to be at war with that king for some time, but also King of England, an independent country. This would help lock the messy politics of both kingdoms together for centuries. Accordingly, for the next few centuries, we will be looking a bit at events in England alongside those of France, as throughout the Middle Ages, they were very closely intertwined, if not essentially the same arena. William died in 1087, with the Norman presence in England secure with his successor. However, Normandy and England had been divided between his two sons. It was during the reign of King Philip I that the First Crusade was called. In fact, calls for it began in France, though it was outside of Philip's domain in the Duchy of Aquitaine. Philip himself was unable to join it, but a very large number of people in the First Crusade were Frenchmen. Philip died in 1108 and was succeeded by his son Louis, who became Louis VI, later known as Louis the Fighter, or more commonly, Louis the Fat. He reigned for 29 years, and would spend that time quarreling and fighting with his neighbors, namely the Anglo-Normans, as well as corrupt officials in his own territory who mistreated the peasantry and exploited them. Louis VI's significance, however, was that he was more successful than his predecessors. He was not a palace prince. This King of France was a respected warrior. His war with Anglo-Normandy was more famous. In 1106, the English king Henry I seized Normandy from his brother in combat. This reunited England and Normandy, but importantly, the perspective had changed. England was not the property of the Duke of Normandy, as it had once been, but now, rather, Normandy was the property of the King of England. Henry seized the French fortress of Gisors in 1108. The English and French met to negotiate the following year. Louis challenged Henry to single combat over their dispute, but Henry refused, and this led to war. They would fight on and off for much of their reigns. He would also have to contend with Henry's ally, Heinrich V of Germany, though Louis was able to draw support from much of France to repel them. Henry I of England's heir to the throne actually died in a drinking and sailing accident, and in order to secure succession, his daughter Matilda married Geoffrey Plantagenet, or Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, shown here in 1128, which again was semi-independent of the King of France. Henry died in 1135. Louis would die in 1137, but in his final year would seize a major opportunity. The Duke of Aquitaine had died, and sought to make Louis the protector of his heiress, his daughter. Louis's heir, who became Louis VII, married the daughter of the Duke of Aquitaine, named Eleanor, thus bringing the Duchy of Aquitaine under the rule of the king, though, and this is important, they were not joined. They were held in a personal union via this marriage, with Aquitaine being Eleanor's possession. Meanwhile, in England, the crown had been seized not by Geoffrey Plantagenet, but by Henry I's nephew, Stephen. This led to a civil war between them and England, in a period remembered as the Anarchy. Matilda died before it was really resolved, but her son Henry of Anjou followed in her footsteps to continue the war. In 1153, King Stephen and Henry came to an agreement. Henry would succeed Stephen to be King of England after his death, which he did the following year. Meanwhile, in France, Louis VII's marriage with Eleanor was strained by the difference in their personalities. Louis was reserved and highly religious. Even though he embarked on the Second Crusade in 1147, the much more lively Eleanor was bored by him, declaring she married a monk, not a king. The frustration grew when she was unable to pursue her desire to have children, likely because of Louis VII's piety, and was thus accused of barrenness. It was not merely a desire, though, it was the duty of a queen throughout history across much of the world to have children and secure the monarchy's continuity. With the Second Crusade having drained the coffers of France and the kingdom in trouble without a male heir, the marriage between the two was annulled in 1152 on the basis that they were too closely related, although in truth they really weren't. This divorce provided Henry II, the soon-to-be King of England, with a fascinating opportunity. He could marry Eleanor of Aquitaine and, through this marriage, claim the Duchy of Aquitaine. This marriage took place in 1152. Thus, when Henry II came to the throne, his domain stretched from the north of England to Normandy, to Anjou, all the way through Aquitaine. Relevant to France, he would also control part of Brittany later on. Historians call this the Angevin Empire, from Anjou. Eleanor had 5 sons by Henry. Louis remarried but still had not sired a male heir, and Henry II placed his eyes on that situation as well. A few years later, Henry II proposed that his son with Eleanor, also named Henry, marry Louis's daughter by another woman. Marrying your daughter with your new wife to your ex-wife's son with her new husband. I say again, medieval royal families. His ambitions here would fail though, as Louis had a son by a third wife named Philip, who would become Philip II Augustus, or Philippe Auguste, after Louis died in 1180. Philip Augustus would be among one of France's greatest medieval kings. Philippe Auguste, aged only 15, began to build up his army and navy. Within a year of his coronation, he went to war against his neighbors, starting with the County of Flanders, and later, of course, Henry II and his Angevin Empire. His primary objective was to break the Angevin Empire apart. 9 years into his reign, Henry II died amid conflict with his sons over power in 1189 and was succeeded by his son Richard I the Lionheart. The rivalry between Philip Augustus and Henry's heir, Richard the Lionheart, was to continue, but their war was interrupted by the Third Crusade, which they both joined along with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and so their dispute was limited to arrogant and spiteful remarks, for the time being, especially on the part of the Lionhearted. The Third Crusade was a partial success. Upon return, war between France and the Angevins resumed. As time progressed, more allies would join against the rising power of France, including the Holy Romans, now under Emperor Otto IV. Then, the conflict was shaken up in 1199, when Richard the Lionheart died unexpectedly while fighting against a rebellious vassal in his French territory. This brought the infamous John I to the throne of England. Peace was temporarily agreed to by John and Philip, but within a few years, the war was back on. King John handled the war poorly, and within a few years, Normandy, and much of the rest of the Angevin domain in France, was under Philip's rule. As the war progressed, fearing the rising power of France, with the Pope's blessing, many other states came to John's aid. On July 27, 1214, French forces met the Holy Roman and Allied forces at the Battle of Bouvines. The French had around 7,000 men, the Allies around 9,000. The French took the field, crushing their enemy. The Battle of Bouvines was a major turning point in European history. John was so weakened by the defeat that he faced insurrection at home by his barons, leading to the Magna Carta. The power of the French monarchy, meanwhile, had grown considerably. Philip's rule and influence spread across much of what is modern France, especially in the north and center of the region. France was becoming a more centralized kingdom. It didn't stop here, however. In the south of France, other events were taking place. A new religious order, possibly spread to France from the east by the Crusaders, had arisen in the Languedoc region over the course of the 12th century, Catharism. The Cathars were a heretical branch of Christians which held a number of uncommon beliefs which rejected the material world. By the 13th century, they had finally gotten on the Catholic Church's last nerve. The rulers of the region, struggling to maintain their own power while being surrounded by other major powers, were reluctant to challenge them on their own. A crusade was called against them in 1209 by Pope Innocent III, termed the Albigensian Crusade. Philip II was reluctant to participate, but of the 10,000 troops that gathered in Lyon for this European crusade, most were Frenchmen. When Pope Innocent III, however, died in 1216, Philip was designated to be its new leader. He instead delegated this task to his son Louis, remembered as Louis le Lion, Louis the Lion. Ultimately, Philip's successors would reap the benefits of this crusade. Philip Augustus died in July of 1223. He had brought the Kingdom of France to a new height and helped to turn it into a major power centered around the monarchy. He was succeeded by his aforementioned son Louis VIII, who continued both the Albigensian Crusade and the war on the Angevins, though he died young, only having reigned for 3 years. He was followed by his son Louis IX, aged only 12 at the time. His mother, Queen Blanche of Castile, would rule as regent in the meantime. The Albigensian Crusade ended briefly in 1229, but conflict and inquisition would continue on and off for another 20 years when new rebellions and resistances broke out. The Crusaders laid waste to the region. As many as 1 million people may have been killed. Following this, Catholicism went into hiding and slowly died out. What future a religion that discouraged reproduction really had anyway is unclear, but what is clear are the political ramifications of these events. As the Crusaders had been led by the French kings, the influence of the French monarchy now spread to the south of the country. Raymond VII, Count of Toulouse, who had resisted the Crusaders, agreed that upon his death, which occurred in 1249, the lands he ruled would be turned over to the Capetian house. Louis IX had begun his adult rule somewhere around the year 1234. Under him, the success of the Capetians in acquiring land would continue forward. In 1242, a major war came once again against England and its allied French subkingdoms, called the Cent Ans War. The English King Henry III, as was so common in this era, intended to press his rights to the lands of the Angevin Empire. In July of 1242, the Battle of Taillebourg was fought. It was another French victory, deciding the war and leading to a 5-year truce between England and France. Louis welcomed the peace treaty. The French and Angevins had been at war on and off for the better part of a century, and now there were other matters to attend to, namely those far east. Louis was an especially pious and just leader, and he felt that he had to crusade in the East for the benefit of the Church. He would embark on 2 in his life, the 7th and 8th Crusades, and as mentioned, had overseen the end of the Albigensian Crusade as well. He did not simply show his piety through war, however. He was known for his generosity to the poor. They often ate from the leftovers of his table. He created a fairer legal system in which he revived an old Roman concept that people are innocent before they are proven to be guilty. He built many hospitals and sick houses, and the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. It is for his unusually pious behavior that he became the one and only Saint Louis, St. Louis, and today cities as far away as America bear his name. His warmth toward his own people, however, was met with coldness to the outgroup. He viewed Cathars, Jews, and Muslims as threats to the welfare of his people. Prostitution, gambling, and usury, which is the practice of loaning money with interest, were banned, and heretics were severely punished. The East, to which Louis IX crusaded, had been quite ruptured in recent decades with the Christian sack of Constantinople decades earlier. Both of his crusades were failures. The 7th Crusade led to his capture, in which he was exchanged for a heavy ransom, and the 8th was a failure after disease hit the crusading camp, including Louis, leading to his death in 1270. He was followed by his son, Philip III, that year. Philip III did not live up to the example set by his father, though in his reign, territory, including the territory of Navarre in modern Spain, was won. He died in 1285 while fighting Aragon in Sicily from dysentery, the same disease which had taken his father. He was succeeded by his son, Philip IV, called Philip the Fair, so called for his handsomeness. In rule, he was not quite so fair, but rather fer, which is French for iron. He was le roi de fer, the Iron King. Indeed, he was rather unscrupulous, especially in comparison to his grandfather, waging war on England and Flanders, which led to the formation of the Auld Alliance with Scotland against England. These wars were marked with mixed results. There were crushing defeats, such as at the Battle of the Golden Spurs, but eventual gains as well. Another notable alliance was the one which was offered to him by the Mongols against their common Muslim foe. The Franco-Mongol alliance may be notable, but not much came from it. Philip IV, and therefore France, struggled with financial problems and debt for much of his rule, partially accrued by his father, but also by his regular wars and lifestyle. Philip IV attempted to resolve these issues by briefly devaluing the French currency, by reducing its silver content. The currency lost 2/3 of its value, which ultimately hurt more than helped, leading to social unrest and its revaluation. Thus, he felt compelled to resort to harsher measures to solve his financial problems. In 1306, Philip expelled the Jews from France and took control of the silver mints which they owned. He argued with Pope Boniface VIII over the right to tax church lands, and would even place an embargo on the papacy over this issue. The Pope called together a council to consider deposing Philip IV, and in response, Philip IV called together a council to condemn the Pope. Philip's council is often regarded in French history as the beginning of les États Généraux, the Estates General, in 1302. This consisted of the meeting of three levels of French society: the clergy, the nobility, and, interestingly, representatives of the common folk. Pope Boniface VIII issued the Unum Sanctum, which declared papal supremacy over the politics of Europe, though this would fail and Boniface was later essentially killed by Italian allies of Philip. The next pope restored relations. In 1305, the French-born Clement V was elected pope. Because the city of Rome was very tumultuous in this time period, and because the semi-independent south of France suited the papacy and its interests, he decided to remain in France, leading to what is termed as the Avignon papacy, a period in which the popes lived in France. Eventually, in this period, the pope would later own the city. Philip's next target was a seemingly unlikely but indeed wealthy group: the Templar Knights. Philip IV owed the Templars a considerable amount of money. Influenced as well by other political and religious motives, he and his ministers managed to plot against them, accusing them of heresy, usury, sodomy, and a whole host of other crimes, many of which were very likely false accusations. A number of Templars were arrested on Friday, October 13, 1307. They were tortured until they admitted to their crimes, and the fact that they had admitted to them was used in trials to justify burning them at the stake. Their pope, Clement V, under the thumb of the King of France, could do little. The Grand Master of the order, Jacques de Molay, was burned the following spring. According to legend, because of the king's treachery, the date of Friday the 13th was to forever remain a cursed day, though this association may not have arisen until much later. Regardless, the curse was no doubt confirmed in the eyes of Europe when the Pope died a month later, and King Philip died 8 months later, at the age of 46. Philip IV was followed by 4 short-lived kings. His first 2 sons and grandsons died young, and so the crown ended up with a 3rd son, Charles IV, in 1322. In this time, tension with the nobility around France had arisen, and relations with England especially had begun to boil as well. Much like his family, King Charles IV died young in 1328 at the age of 33, with no male heir. He was to be the last of the Capetian kings of France. A question now fell upon the French people. Who was to succeed him? 2 options appeared. Philip, from the House of Valois, a cousin, was a prominent choice. However, across the Channel, not everyone agreed. The ambitious King Edward III of England made an argument for his right to succession as king of both France and England. This disagreement would lead to war that would outlast both of them. Over 100 years of war. In the next video, we will discuss this 100 Years' War and how France pushed through it under the leadership of some unlikely heroes. However, as France emerges from this war, we will watch as it becomes a modernized nation. We will look at France's role in the colonization of the Americas, Asia, and beyond, and the supreme power of the Bourbon monarchy. Then, we will watch as this monarchy falls to revolution, and then how this revolution falls to an ambitious Corsican general, until we reach modern France. The next video will be titled The French Empires and Republics, or something like that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, I invite you to come check out the rest of Fire of Learning and to subscribe to see more videos like this in the future, especially my History of Nations and Peoples documentary playlist. We would appreciate donations on Patreon to help with the cost of producing these videos, the link to which you can find in the description. You can support the channel with as little as a $1 contribution, however, simply subscribing to our YouTube channel for free is also a large help. A special thanks to our Patreon supporters listed here. We are also on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, so come check us out there too. Merci for watching.